November 19, 1944. The transport truck rumbled through the iron gates of Camp Sterling, a makeshift prisoner of war facility 30 miles outside Boston, Massachusetts. Inside the canvas-covered bed, 42 German women sat in rigid silence, their gray auxiliary uniforms dusty from the Atlantic crossing and the long journey from the port. They had been captured during the Allied advance through France and Belgium, serving as communications specialists, nurses, clerks, and translators for the Wehrmacht. Now they were prisoners in enemy territory, and everything they had been taught about Americans told them to expect the worst. 24-year-old Elizabeth Hartman, known to her friends as Lise, pressed her back against the truck's wooden slats and tried to steady her breathing. She had served as a signals operator in Heidelberg before being transferred to a forward communications post outside Paris. When the Allies broke through, her unit had scattered. She had been captured while trying to reach German lines, still carrying the codebook she had been trained to destroy. The American soldiers who took her prisoner had been surprisingly gentle, almost apologetic, which had confused her more than cruelty would have. Beside her, 22-year-old Sophie Kruger clutched a small cloth bag containing her only possessions, a spare uniform shirt, a wooden comb, and a photograph of her family in Dortmund. Sophie had worked as an auxiliary nurse, tending to wounded soldiers in field hospitals. She had joined the Women's Corps, believing she was serving her country's defense, helping to heal rather than harm. Now she wondered if healing German soldiers had made her complicit in something larger and darker than she had understood. The truck lurched to a stop. American voices called out in English, words the women couldn't fully understand but recognized as commands. The canvas flap opened, and winter sunlight flooded in, making them squint. A woman, in American military uniform, stood at the tailgate, her expression neither cruel nor kind, simply professional. She was Captain Mary Patricia Collins, one of the few female officers assigned to oversee prisoner facilities. "Welcome to Camp Sterling," she said in clear, measured English. A male translator beside her repeated the words in German. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Follow the rules, and you will be treated fairly." Lise exchanged glances with Sophie. Fairly. What did that word mean when applied to enemies? They had been told that Americans were ruthless, that they showed no mercy to Germans, especially to women who had worn the uniform. Yet here was this captain speaking of rules and fairness, as if such things mattered even in war. The women climbed down from the truck one by one, their legs stiff from the journey. As they formed ragged lines in the compound yard, Lise noticed something unexpected. The smell of cooking drifted from a nearby building. Rich, savory, unmistakably the scent of roasting meat and vegetables. It smelled like Sunday dinner in Heidelberg, like her mother's kitchen before the war consumed everything familiar. It was a scent that promised something impossible. Comfort in captivity. Home in enemy territory. The barracks assigned to the German women had been hastily converted from storage buildings. Rows of metal cots lined the walls, each with a thin mattress, 2 wool blankets, and a small wooden footlocker. It was Spartan but cleaner than Lise had expected. The windows, though barred, let in pale November sunlight. The building retained heat from a coal stove in the center, making it almost comfortable compared to the field stations where she had served in France. The women moved through their first day in a daze of uncertainty. They were issued additional blankets, basic toiletries, and tin cups and plates for meals. American guards, both male and female, watched them with curiosity rather than hostility. Some guards were young, barely older than Trudy Braun, the youngest of their group at 20 years old. Others were middle-aged men who looked like they belonged on farms or in offices rather than guarding enemy prisoners. That first evening, they were led to the mess hall for dinner. The room was larger than expected, with long wooden tables and benches. The German women sat together at one end, instinctively clustering for safety and solidarity. American soldiers occupied the other tables, their conversations a rumble of incomprehensible English punctuated by occasional laughter. The food arrived on metal trays. Boiled potatoes, carrots, and some kind of meat stew. It wasn't appetizing, but it was hot and plentiful. Lise ate mechanically, aware that Sophie beside her was struggling to swallow. The younger woman's hands trembled slightly as she lifted her spoon. They were all struggling with the same confusion. This wasn't what they had been prepared for. Rosa Fischer, at 29, the oldest among them, leaned forward and spoke in low German. "Eat. Whatever happens, we need our strength." Rosa had worked as a records clerk in Hanover, managing supply documentation for Wehrmacht units. She had a practical, no-nonsense demeanor that the other women found reassuring. Saturday passed in a blur of orientation and regulations explained through translators. They learned the daily schedule, the rules of the compound, the procedures for mail and Red Cross communications. They learned that they were not the first German prisoners at Camp Sterling, though they were the first women. Male prisoners had been held here earlier in the year before being transferred to larger facilities. Then Sunday morning arrived, and everything changed. Lise woke to that smell again. Richer this time, more pronounced. The scent of meat roasting slowly, of onions and herbs, of potatoes crisping and fat, it drifted through the barracks like a memory made tangible. Around her, other women were stirring, their faces reflecting the same confusion she felt. "What is that?" Sophie whispered. Inge Müller, who had served as an interpreter and spoke fluent English, sat up on her cot. "It's Sunday," she said quietly. "Americans do something special on Sundays. They cook big meals, family meals." The words hung in the cold morning air, family meals. The concept seemed absurd in a prison camp, yet the evidence was undeniable. Somewhere in this compound, someone was cooking the kind of meal that belonged to peacetime, to homes with mothers and tables set with care. Trudy, young and homesick, started to cry softly. The smell reminded her of Mannheim, of Sunday afternoons before the war, when her family gathered after church. The memory was so vivid it hurt. The Sunday morning routine proceeded as usual. Roll call at 700 hours, basic calisthenics in the cold compound yard, then washing and tidying of the barracks. But the smell of cooking grew stronger with each passing hour, and it was impossible to ignore. The German women moved through their tasks in distracted silence, their stomachs responding to aromas that spoke of abundance rather than rationing, of celebration rather than survival. At 1100 hours, Captain Collins appeared at the barracks door with her translator, Sergeant William Hayes, a bookish man in his 40s who had taught German literature at a college in Vermont before the war. The women immediately stood at attention, their military training overriding months of confusion and displacement. "At ease," Captain Collins said, and Hayes translated. She looked at the assembled women with an expression that Lise couldn't quite read. "Today is Sunday. In America, Sunday is traditionally a day of rest and family meals. The camp commander has authorized a special dinner this afternoon, and you are invited to join the American staff in the main mess hall at 1300 hours." The translator's words fell into stunned silence. Lise felt Sophie's hand find hers, squeezing tightly. An invitation to eat with their captors? To sit at the same tables as American soldiers? It violated everything they understood about the proper distance between enemies. Rosa Fischer raised her hand hesitantly. "Captain, we don't understand. Is this mandatory?" Hayes translated the question, and Captain Collins shook her head. "No, this is an invitation, not an order. You may eat in your regular mess area if you prefer. But Commander Thompson believes that Sunday dinner should be shared, even here. He believes that breaking bread together reminds us all that we're human beings first, soldiers second." After the captain left, the barracks erupted in urgent, whispered German. Inge Müller tried to explain. "It's an American custom. Sunday dinner is sacred to them. It's about family, about community. By inviting us, they're saying we're not just prisoners to be guarded." "But what are they really saying?" Trudy asked, her young face troubled. "That we're forgiven? That what we did doesn't matter?" "Maybe that's exactly the point," Rosa said slowly. Maybe they're showing us that they can separate the person from the politics, that they can hate what Germany did without hating every German. Sophie looked at Lise with frightened eyes. What if it's a trick? What if they're testing us to see who's weak enough to accept kindness from the enemy? Lise had no answer. She had been trained to expect interrogation techniques, psychological manipulation, efforts to break their loyalty, but she had never been trained for this, for genuine hospitality, for an invitation that asked nothing in return except their presence at a table. At 12:45, the women made their decision. All 42 of them formed a line outside the barracks, dressed in their cleanest uniforms. If this was a test, they would face it together. If it was genuine, they would accept it with dignity. They walked toward the mess hall like soldiers, marching toward an uncertain fate, not knowing they were walking toward the beginning of their transformation. The mess hall had been transformed. Long tables were covered with white cloths, actual plates had replaced metal trays, and at the center of each table sat large serving platters. The German women stopped in the doorway, frozen by the sight before them. Pot roast, mountains of it, dark and glistening with rich gravy. Surrounding the meat were roasted potatoes, carrots turned sweet from slow cooking, and pearl onions. Steam rose from the platters, carrying the aroma that had been tormenting them all morning. American soldiers already sat at the tables, but they had left spaces open so that Germans and Americans would sit side by side. Commander Richard Thompson stood at the front of the hall. "Welcome," he said, and Sergeant Hayes translated. "In my home in Ohio, Sunday dinner is when family comes together. Today, you are our guests. Please, sit." The German women moved, hesitantly toward the empty seats. Lise found herself sitting between Sophie and a young American private with red hair and freckles. Across the table, Rosa sat next to an older sergeant who reminded Lise of her father. Commander Thompson said a brief prayer in English. The German women bowed their heads respectfully. Then the serving began, and Lise watched as the American soldiers passed the platters to the Germans first, serving them before taking portions for themselves. The red-haired private offered her the pot roast platter with shaking hands. "Ma'am," he said quietly. Lise took the serving fork and lifted a thick slice of meat onto her plate, then passed the platter to Sophie. For a long moment, no one ate. The German women stared at their plates, at food more generous than they had seen in years. Real meat, not the thin soups and gray bread that had sustained them, vegetables that still had color and texture. Gravy rich enough to be called decadent. Then Rosa Fisher picked up her fork and knife and cut into her pot roast. The meat yielded easily, tender from hours of slow cooking. She lifted the bite to her mouth, chewed slowly, and her eyes closed. For just a moment, her face showed something other than careful neutrality. It showed memory. It showed longing. It showed the beginning of surrender. That first bite broke the spell. Around the hall, German women began to eat, and with each taste, something shifted. This wasn't prison food designed merely to sustain life. This was food prepared with attention and care, seasoned properly, cooked with skill. Someone had spent hours preparing this meal, knowing it would be served to enemy prisoners. Lise cut into her own portion and tasted something unexpected. The pot roast reminded her of her grandmother's Sunday dinners in Heidelberg, of meals her mother had prepared before rationing made such abundance impossible. It tasted like peacetime, like safety. Beside her, Sophie was crying quietly, tears running down her cheeks as she ate. The young private looked alarmed, unsure what to do, but Lise understood. These weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of recognition. The taste of being cared for after so long, believing they deserved only punishment. The following Sunday, the invitation came again, and the Sunday after that. What had begun as a single unprecedented meal evolved into something more significant, a ritual. A weekly gathering that marked the passage of time, not with military precision, but with the rhythms of ordinary life. The German women stopped hesitating at the mess hall door. They began to anticipate Sunday mornings, to wake to that familiar aroma with something other than confusion. They began to recognize it as the scent of the one day each week when they were allowed to feel less like prisoners and more like people. By the fourth Sunday, conversations had begun. The red-haired private, whose name Lise learned was Daniel Morrison from a farm in Iowa, had started attempting basic German phrases. His pronunciation was terrible, mangling vowels and consonants in ways that would have been offensive if his earnestness hadn't been so obvious. "Guten Tag," he would say carefully as Lise sat down beside him, and she would respond with equally careful English. "Good afternoon." Sophie found herself seated regularly next to Corporal James Martinez, a medic from New Mexico whose grandmother had emigrated from Spain. He recognized in Sophie the careful hands and attentive manner of someone trained in medical work. Through gestures and simple words, they began sharing knowledge. Sophie taught him a German technique for bandaging difficult wounds. He showed her how American medics treated shock differently than German protocols required. Rosa Fisher, with her organizational mind, had noticed something remarkable. The pot roast recipe changed slightly each week. Sometimes the gravy was thicker, darker. Sometimes there were different vegetables, different herbs. She realized that the camp cook, a massive man named Sergeant Paul Kowalski, whose family had come from Poland, was experimenting. He was trying to find the version that most pleased his unusual Sunday guests. One Sunday in late December, Rosa gathered her courage and approached Sergeant Kowalski after the meal. Through Inga Muller's translation, she asked about the cooking process. Kowalski's face lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who loved his craft. He spent 20 minutes explaining his technique, how he seared the meat first, how he built the gravy from the drippings, how he knew when the vegetables had reached perfect tenderness. The next Sunday, Kowalski invited Rosa into the kitchen before the meal. He showed her his workspace, his ingredients, his methods. Rosa watched with the concentration she had once applied to Wehrmacht supply records, now focused entirely on understanding how to transform simple ingredients into comfort and care. By January, 3 more German women had joined these kitchen sessions. Trudy Braun, homesick and young, found solace in learning the recipes that reminded her of her mother's cooking. Inge Müller discovered that food was a language that needed no translation. The kitchen became a classroom where former enemies taught each other, where German precision met American improvisation, where the act of cooking together dissolved barriers that military protocol had tried to maintain. The Sunday meals had become more than just dinner. They had become the center of a transformation none of them had anticipated. Each week, the conversations grew longer, the laughter came more easily, and the line between captor and captive blurred a little more. The pot roast wasn't just feeding their bodies. It was nourishing something they hadn't realized was starving: their capacity to trust again, their ability to see humanity in faces they had been taught to fear. February 1945 brought news that shattered the fragile peace the German women had built around Sunday dinners. American newspapers began publishing photographs and reports from liberated concentration camps. The images were grainy but unmistakable. Skeletal figures behind barbed wire, mass graves. Evidence of systematic horror that most of the women claimed they had never known existed. Captain Collins made the decision to allow the German prisoners access to these newspapers. She believed they had a right to know what had been done in their country's name. Sergeant Hayes placed the papers in the camp library without comment, letting the women discover them on their own. Lise found them first. She had gone to the library seeking English practice materials and instead found herself staring at photographs that made her hands shake. Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald. Names she had never heard, places that had apparently existed in the same Germany where she had grown up, gone to school, celebrated Christmas with her family. Sophie discovered Lise there, tears streaming silently down her face. "Is it real?" Sophie whispered in German. "Did our country really do these things?" Other women gathered around the newspapers, their faces reflecting shock and disbelief. These were not hardened Nazi ideologues but young women who had joined auxiliary services believing they were defending their homeland. Now they were confronting the possibility that they had been part of something far darker than they had ever imagined. Inge Müller, who could read English fluently, translated the articles aloud in a hollow voice. The numbers were incomprehensible. Thousands dead, tens of thousands. The systematic nature of it, the deliberate cruelty, the industrial efficiency applied to human suffering. Rosa Fischer sat down heavily, her usual practical composure crumbling. "We wore the same uniform," she said quietly. "We served the same government that built those places. How can we claim we didn't know?" That night, the barracks was silent, except for quiet weeping. The women lay in their cots grappling with a terrible question. What kind of Germany had they been serving? What kind of Germany would they return to? Trudy Braun, at 20 the youngest among them, asked the question that haunted them all. How can we face the Americans at Sunday dinner now? How can we sit at their table knowing what our people did? But Sunday came regardless, and with it came the familiar aroma of pot roast. The German women gathered outside the mess hall, uncertain whether they deserved to enter. They felt the weight of collective guilt, of being German in a moment when being German meant being associated with unimaginable evil. Commander Thompson appeared at the door. He had seen the newspapers. He knew what the women had learned. But his face showed no hatred, only a sadness that acknowledged their struggle. "The invitation still stands," he said through Sergeant Hayes. "What your government did doesn't change who you are as individuals. Come, eat. We'll face this truth together." It was the hardest meal any of them had ever eaten. The pot roast tasted the same, but everything else had changed. March brought the first mail from Germany since the women's capture. The International Red Cross had finally established communication channels through the chaos of a collapsing Reich. 23 letters arrived at Camp Sterling, distributed by Captain Collins with gentle hands and worried eyes. Not every woman received mail. For 19 of them, the silence was more terrible than any news could have been. Lise held her letter with trembling fingers. The envelope was battered, forwarded through multiple offices, stamped with official marks from 3 different countries. The handwriting was her aunt's, not her mother's, and that absence told her something before she even opened it. She sat on her cot and read words that confirmed her worst fears. Her mother and younger brother had died in an Allied bombing raid on Heidelberg in December. Her father's whereabouts were unknown. Her aunt was living in the rubble of their neighborhood with 4 other families, sharing 2 rooms and whatever food they could find. Sophie's letter brought different but equally devastating news. Her family in Dortmund had survived, but her father had been arrested by Allied authorities for his administrative role in local government. Her mother and sisters were refugees, displaced to a camp somewhere in the British zone. They didn't know when or if they would see their home again. Rosa Fischer received no letter at all. Hanover had been heavily bombed. The Red Cross could find no record of her family in any refugee registry or displaced persons camp. The silence suggested the worst, though Rosa refused to speak the possibility aloud. Only Inga Müller received what might be called good news. Her parents in Essen had survived, though their home was destroyed. They were living with relatives in a village outside the city. Her mother's letter begged her to come home as soon as possible, saying they needed her desperately. The mail call transformed the barracks into a place of mourning. Women who had maintained composure through capture, transport, and imprisonment finally broke under the weight of knowing what they had lost. The Germany they had imagined returning to damaged but recognizable, painful but familiar did not exist. In its place was a landscape of ruins, scattered families, and collective shame. That Sunday, fewer women came to dinner. Some couldn't face the Americans after reading about the destruction Allied bombs had brought to their cities. Others felt that accepting comfort while their families suffered in rubble seemed like a betrayal. But Lise came. She sat in her usual seat next to Private Morrison and tried to eat pot roast while thinking about her mother and brother buried under stones that had once been their home. Morrison noticed her barely touched plate and her start of frown, red-rimmed eyes. He didn't speak. He simply reached across the space between them and briefly touched her hand in wordless sympathy. That simple gesture broke something in Lise. This American soldier whose bombs might have killed her family was offering her compassion. The contradiction was unbearable and somehow necessary. She began to cry, and Morrison, young and uncertain, did the only thing he knew how to do. He passed her the basket of bread and quietly said, "I'm sorry. It wasn't enough." But it was something. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Church bells rang across America, while in prisoner of war camps from Texas to Massachusetts, German soldiers prepared for repatriation to their defeated homeland. At Camp Sterling, Captain Collins called a special assembly for the 42 German women. The war was over. Official procedures for their return to Germany would begin within 2 weeks. The women gathered in the mess hall where they had shared so many Sunday dinners. Captain Collins stood before them with official documents from the War Department, her expression compassionate but professional. "Ladies, you will be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before being released to return to your homes. Transportation has been arranged." The words should have brought relief. Freedom. The end of captivity. But as Lise looked around at the faces of her fellow prisoners, she saw not joy but fear. What were they returning to? Letters had painted a picture of devastation beyond imagination. Cities in ruins. Families scattered or dead. A country that no longer resembled the one they had left. After the assembly, Rosa Fischer gathered a small group in the barracks. Lise, Sophie, Ing, Trudy, and 3 others. "I need to say something that might sound like madness," Rosa began carefully. "I have nowhere to return to in Germany, no family I can find, no home left standing. But here, I have work in the kitchen that gives me purpose. I have Sunday dinners where I'm treated with dignity. I have learned more about cooking in 4 months than in 29 years of life." "You want to stay?" Lise said quietly. It wasn't a question. "I want to ask if staying is possible," Rosa replied. "I know how it sounds, choosing captivity over freedom. But this place has become more of a home than anything waiting for me in Hanover." Sophie spoke next, her voice barely a whisper. "My father is in prison. My family is scattered. Corporal Martinez has been teaching me American medical techniques. He says I could become a real nurse here, get proper certification. In Germany, I would be just another refugee with nothing." One by one, the women shared their impossible thoughts. Trudy had no family left at all. Inga's family wanted her home, but she had discovered a gift for teaching languages that America might value. Lise thought of her aunt living in rubble, of a Heidelberg that no longer existed, of Sunday mornings when pot roast made her feel less alone. "If we ask this," Ing said practically, "we need to understand what we're asking. To stay means admitting that Germany is not our home anymore. That we choose America over the fatherland. We would be seen as traitors by other Germans. Or," Lise said slowly, "we would be seen as people who chose humanity over nationalism, who chose the place that fed us over the place that fed us lies." The decision was made. 8 women would make an unprecedented request. They would ask their captors for permission to remain as guests rather than return as refugees to a homeland that felt more foreign than this Massachusetts camp. The request shocked military officials in Washington, but after lengthy deliberations, an unprecedented decision was made. The 8 women would be reclassified as displaced persons and processed for potential immigration status. They would no longer be prisoners of war, but they would need sponsors, employment, and housing in American communities willing to accept former enemy nationals. Commander Thompson made calls to local churches and civic organizations. The response surprised even him. The story of German women who had been transformed by Sunday dinners resonated with communities still grappling with how to process victory without vengeance. Within 2 weeks, all 8 women had found sponsors. The Henderson family, owners of a small restaurant in nearby Brookline, offered to sponsor Rosa Fisher. Mrs. Helen Henderson had visited the camp as part of a church outreach program and been impressed by Rosa's organizational skills and passion for cooking. "We could use someone like you in our kitchen," she told Rosa through Inga's translation. "Someone who understands that food is about more than just filling stomachs." Corporal Martinez arranged for Sophie Kruger to continue her medical training at Boston General Hospital under the supervision of Dr. Robert Crane, who had served as a medic in France and believed in second chances. Sophie would work as a nurse's aide while studying for American certification, living with the Martinez family until she could afford her own lodging. Private Morrison's family in Iowa sent a telegram offering to sponsor Lise Hartman. His mother, reading her son's letters about the German woman who had taught him about grief and forgiveness, felt moved to help. Lise would work as a translator for a manufacturing company in Des Moines that did business with European displaced persons organizations. The other 5 women found similar arrangements. Trudy would live with a family in Worcester and work in their textile mill. Ing secured a position teaching German at a private school in Boston. Each woman was given a chance to build a new life, but none of them forgot what had made that life possible. On their final Sunday at Camp Sterling, before departing for their new homes, the 8 women prepared one last pot roast dinner. Sergeant Kowalski supervised as Rosa led the group through the recipe they had learned over months of Sunday mornings. They seared the meat until it was perfectly browned. They built the gravy from drippings, adding herbs and wine with careful precision. They arranged the vegetables so they would cook to tender sweetness. When the meal was ready, they served it to the American soldiers who had served them first all those months ago. Commander Thompson said grace, his voice thick with emotion. "We gathered as enemies and part as friends. May we never forget that the greatest victories are won not on battlefields, but at tables where former enemies choose to see each other's humanity." Lise looked around at the faces gathered there. American and German, former captors and captives. Now simply people who had shared enough Sunday dinners to understand that home was not always the place you came from, but sometimes the place that chose to keep you. 25 years later, October 1970, Rosa Fisher Henderson stood in the kitchen of Henderson's restaurant in Brookline, Massachusetts, teaching her daughter-in-law the pot roast recipe that had changed her life. The restaurant had grown from a small family establishment into a local institution known throughout Boston for its Sunday dinners that somehow tasted like home regardless of where customers came from. "The secret is patience," Rosa said, in English that still carried traces of her German accent. "You cannot rush the cooking. Low and slow, that is how you make something tough become tender. It is true for meat. It is true for people." Her daughter-in-law, Sarah, married to Rosa's adopted son Thomas Henderson, listened carefully. She had heard the story many times but never tired of it, how Rosa had arrived in America as a prisoner of war, how Sunday pot roast had taught her that enemies could become family, how she had met Thomas, the Hendersons' biological son, and how their marriage had sealed her transformation from German prisoner to American mother. Across town, Sophie Kruger Martinez prepared her own pot roast in a kitchen filled with photographs. Dr. Sophie Martinez, now head of nursing at Boston General Hospital. She had never married Corporal Martinez, but she had married his brother, and their 3 children had grown up hearing stories about Sunday dinners in a prison camp where their mother learned that healing could happen anywhere people chose compassion over hatred. Lise Hartman Morrison lived in Iowa, where she had married Daniel Morrison 5 years after the war ended. Their farmhouse kitchen smelled of pot roast every Sunday, a tradition she had maintained without fail for 2.5 decades. Her children, fully American but taught to speak some German, understood that their mother's past was complicated, that she had served a terrible cause but found redemption through the simple act of breaking bread with former enemies. That October evening, the 8 women who had chosen to stay gathered for a reunion in Boston. They met at Henderson's restaurant, now successful enough to close for private events. The table was set as it had been that first Sunday in Camp Sterling. White cloth, good plates, pot roast at the center, surrounded by the vegetables they had learned to prepare together. They were no longer young women. Gray threaded through their hair, their faces carried the lines of lives fully lived. But when they sat down together, they were transported back to that mess hall where everything had changed. "Do you ever regret it?" Trudy asked. Now Trudy Wilson, mother of 4, grandmother of 2. Choosing to stay. Inge Mueller-Carson, a respected language professor at Boston University, shook her head. "I regret what Germany did. I regret not knowing sooner. But staying here? Learning that nationality matters less than character? No. Never." They raised their glasses in a toast that had become their tradition. To Sunday dinners. To second chances. To the families we found in the least likely places. The pot roast tasted exactly as it had 25 years earlier. Rich, comforting, tasting like the truth they had learned in that prison camp. That the strongest bonds are forged not through shared bloodlines but through shared meals and the courage to see humanity in unexpected faces.